Hello out there. Welcome to another episode of Kink Candid. Shay here with Jay. And tonight we come to you with a special episode we've been planning for a bit on the subject of poly. For our listeners who may be less familiar, poly is short for polyamory, which refers to non-monogamous relationships. It can take a number of forms, but that's the core of it, is we're talking about non-monogamous relationships.
And this is something we both have more than a passing familiarity with.
We have been in poly situations in the past, both of us have. I am currently engaged in a poly relationship as we speak. So it's something that's sort of near and dear to our hearts. And there are some, shall we say, trends popping up in the community as a whole around this subject that we feel should probably be addressed.
You say trends, I say bad habits.
Both are fair. So first, a brief sort of explanation. When we talk about poly, we are talking, as I said, about polyamory, non-monogamous relationships, essentially any romantic relationship that includes more than two people. It can take a number of forms. It can mean that two people start out in a relationship and then a third and or more people are added to that relationship later. It can mean that all three people or four people in the relationship, or more people as the case may be, are all interconnected and engaged in relationships with each other. It can mean that two people have a relationship and each of those two people also has relationships with other people that are independent of that first relationship. There's a number of ways that can sort of look in practice. But all of it
can mean a household full of people who are all connected.
And they all sort of interconnect together and fall under the broader umbrella of polyamory as a whole.
Right.
So now that we've sort of talked about what poly is, the first thing that I know is near and dear, and my listeners who have listened to the recent soapbox that went up on our show will recognize this particular topic. Let's talk about what poly is not.
Yes,
Let's
please.
start there. One of the key things about poly is that whether or not all of the people are connected to each other romantically, they all know what is going on.
Everybody's acquainted, everybody's communicated, everybody knows what the rules are. Nobody's left in the dark.
My husband and I have a girlfriend. I won't out her in any way, as I don't have her permission to do that. But suffice it to say that all of us know exactly what the situation is. What's allowed, what isn't allowed, what happens, what doesn't happen. There is no behind anyone's back. If anyone involved, whether directly or indirectly, is unaware of what is happening, it is in fact not poly.
You've left the realm of poly and entered the realm of cheating. Cheating is not poly.
I see this a lot. You see it online. You see the conversations. I have a dom and we're not a romantic relationship because my dom is married. Or I have a sub and we don't have a romantic relationship because my sub is married. And in some of those cases, the dom or sub, the person's partner, is aware and says, you have this kinky need that I cannot fulfill, so I'm okay with you having this additional relationship. This is a form of poly. In some cases, however, we find, my dom or my sub is married, and no, the husband, wife, what have you, their spouse, partner, doesn't know. And it's often defended because, well, poly's a thing.
Poly is a thing, but poly is a specific thing.
And it bothers me when I see poly people defending that.
Yeah. You're not the only one it bothers. It leads to hard feelings. It leads to broken relationships. It can lead to actual physical harm, disease, if you're not careful. Because when you start playing with people who aren't actually communicating with your partners, and then you have lost the presumption that they will communicate with you, which means that you don't know. You don't know who they've been with before. You don't know if they're clean. You don't know what they're carrying. And so disease is a thing.
And that, it brings up an important point about the subject of poly, is that poly relationships can be amazing. Let me say that. And they can be awesome, and they can work long term. They can be fantastic. But
they usually are.
They often are, yes. But for that to happen, it requires several things. It requires the fact that everyone knows and everyone consents, and it requires a lot of communication and trust. And that's really, really important to note, that if you want to do poly, communication and trust are going to be massive in order to make this work. Everyone has to be on the same page. Otherwise, it falls apart very, very quickly. And I have been in fantastic poly relationships. I have been in poly relationships that ended in a fantastically awful fashion because the communication or the trust or both disappeared. And so that's something I want our listeners to really, really be aware of, that if you want to do this, and it's not as simple as you just get to sleep with whoever you want whenever you want.
And that's not poly. It may be something, but that's not, no. There are many things I would call that. Poly doesn't have any one of them.
I saw another sort of misconception about it. It was not a discussion specifically about poly, but I saw this just literally an hour ago. A discussion about, it was another one of the discussions of, I want X thing in my relationship and my partner is not comfortable with it. And what do I do? Which we've talked about on the show a couple of times because it comes up a lot. But one of the responses was something to the effect of, you should make it into an open relationship so you can do what you want and still have your original partner.
Yeah.
And it bothered me because there were several things wrong with it. One person cannot make an open or a poly relationship.
No. Everyone has to agree.
Everyone has to agree to it. And it's not just about being able to do what you want and still keep your original relationship. That's not fair, and it's not okay. Now, on that note, as far as things being not fair, I'm going to wade into some potentially dangerous waters. Let me do that a couple
times. I don't
think
there's anything potential about it. Let's be honest here. Nobody's going to be comfortable about this, but it's necessary.
These things need to be said. If you are in a relationship, such as it is, with someone who has another partner who does not know about you, please do not ask the poly community to defend you and what you are doing, because that is not poly. That is cheating. And I am aware that in some cases these situations arise because someone lies. I have been there. I have been the one that was lied to. And that's its own issue. But that's not what I'm referring to. But if you are telling me, as it was said to me just yesterday, my dom is married, no, his wife doesn't know, we have a fully committed relationship, and he's a great family man, I believe was the phrasing that was used.
You may be right. He may be a great family man, but it's not your family.
Well, and I would raise the question that if he's messing around behind his spouse's back, that would suggest to me that there is a decent chance that he is in fact not as great a family man as you think.
True.
And poly requires an actual commitment, and it requires trust. If someone is cheating on someone else to engage in it, it is A, not poly, and B, does not engender the kind of trust that is needed to make poly work. As I said, I have been sort of the other woman, and it was not because by my choice, it was because of lies. And it's very easy to fall for the lies, and I know that better than anyone. But once you realize what is going on, it should irrevocably break the trust. And it's never going to work. And poly especially. Relationships require trust. Poly relationships require even more. Which is something that I think a lot of people don't get. People see poly and they think, oh, that sounds so great. I get to have, sexual relationships with multiple people. That's fantastic and great. Well, and it is, but
it can be fantastic. It can also be very difficult. Usually is very difficult. I would raise the argument that if it isn't difficult, if it doesn't take effort and focus and sacrifice, then somebody's doing it wrong.
Because you are juggling. Poly isn't just about sex.
Sex is I would say sex is the smallest part of what poly is about, to be honest.
Legitimate poly is about actual relationships. And as such, think about how much work goes into your relationship on any given day. The communication, the trust, the work that goes into maintaining a relationship. Now imagine there are 3 or 4 relationships involved.
Yeah.
The work is exponentially more. It requires more communication, more trust, more work. You get more benefits too. Don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting that it's all just hard work and no reward.
Oh, yeah. It's
not all work and no play, but it does require actual work and effort to make that work. We like I said, we are poly currently, and we do have another partner, and there's a lot of communication between our other partner and myself, between our other partner and my husband, between my husband and myself. This is between all 3 of us. There's work involved in making this work, and it requires that I have absolute trust in him, especially. Now, we are what is affectionately known as hierarchical poly, which is a topic that I definitely want to get into because I get told a lot that hierarchical poly is bad and unfair and evil and wrong and all manner of other ugly things.
They can say it. It doesn't make it true.
First, hierarchical poly means that there is a hierarchy of relationships in the situation. There is a primary and a secondary relationship, and there are, in some cases, depending on the arrangement in question, there may be even tertiary relationships, depending on how your poly arrangement looks. We have only primary and secondary. And what that essentially means is that our relationship is, my husband and I, is the primary relationship for the two of us. It is always going to be first. It existed first. It will continue to exist even if the secondary relationship ceases to. I am his primary. Now, as I said, I am told frequently these days that is bad. It's terrible. It's evil and wrong. And I don't agree.
I severely wish that the people saying this would stop.
I don't think it's inherently wrong. It does require some additional communication because, again, everyone needs to be on board and aware of what the situation is. There was no lying involved here. Everybody knew up front exactly what was and was not on the table. My place, not up for grabs.
No.
But you know, it's and not everyone does hierarchical. Sometimes all of the relationships are sort of equal, and sometimes they're independent of each other. Sometimes they're all interconnected. Sometimes they're all entirely equal. I have seen cases where one person has multiple boyfriends or girlfriends or what have you, and they're all essentially equals. And that's fine if that's what works for them. It's not what we do, and that, you know, I don't know exactly when that became a horrible, awful thing because, like I said, when I first sort of started, that was sort of a common assumption that you would have a primary and a secondary. Apparently that is one of the many things that has changed since I have been in this lifestyle.
I'm going to stop you here for a second because you and I may be a bit biased. When we started, we came into this from, and here comes one of the evil words in this thing that we do, at least as far as so many are concerned. We started in the Gregorian lifestyle, and that may be why we have a more favorable view of hierarchy than some of our listeners. To be fair,
that is a fair point. That is a fair point. It is most poly setups within the Gregorian lifestyle are hierarchical in that way. There is a clear hierarchy. You know, there is definitely a first and a second in that situation, and that's very common in that setting. I'm getting the impression that is not necessarily true outside of that, and it's certainly not necessarily true of that now, or so I am told. I don't know, and you may be right, that may always have been the case for non-Gorians, but I wouldn't know. But it's certainly not the case as much these days. It's quite common, apparently, to think that there are entire articles and blogs and things written online about how awful it is, what they refer to as couples privilege, in the sense that...
Who writes these articles? I'm going to say it again. I'm really glad that you're the one taking care of our social media presence because you've got a much better temper than I do.
So I've seen it. They write about what they call couples privilege, which is essentially exactly what we have here, which is that the initial couple maintains a primary relationship status and is considered more stable, so to speak, sometimes than the secondary relationships. I don't know that that's necessarily a fair assumption that the secondary relationships are not as stable. They're, in my opinion, often just as stable. They're just different. But they don't like it. It's very bad, apparently.
They can continue not to like it, but I'm not fussed, to be honest.
And so, you know, it's a common sort of complaint that we're doing it wrong. Which, like I said, like many things within this thing that we do, there really is not a lot of really wrong ways to do things. The big wrong way when it comes to all things poly is the assumption that it's okay for one person who is either directly or indirectly involved to be unaware. It is not. But so I see this, this sort of attitude, and it's very nasty. It's very ugly. And I think that reiterates the previous statement that I wish more people understood that poly is not inherently just about sex. It really isn't. And I think there's a common misconception that it just means woohoo orgy, essentially.
No, please. No.
And it really doesn't mean that at all. It also does not mean that you can simply go out and... Go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead. And then I'll finish.
It doesn't mean orgies, and it doesn't necessarily also mean that you can just wander about sleeping with anyone and everyone because, well, we're poly, so it doesn't matter. No, that's not. No.
Yes, it does matter. And what I was going to say is I've been in poly relationships for the lion's share of my adult life now, and orgies not really a thing. I'm sure there are things for some people, but not in my life.
I don't think I cannot think of a point in which in my life I've never actually participated in an actual orgy. I have had threesomes, but that's its own thing.
I think orgy implies significantly more.
That's my understanding of the term, is that it requires more than simply three people. That does not count. And so, no, never an orgy. And it also doesn't mean that I can just go sleep with whoever I want.
Thank God.
And just be like, oh, by the way, I'm sleeping with this dude today. Like, that's not a thing.
Please, no.
Everything that we do requires sometimes a ridiculous amount of communication, honestly. But the other thing that's come up is and it goes back to our previous episode about the concept of entitlement and these sorts of attitudes that have become pervasive in at least the social media side of the community as a whole. There are two misconceptions that I see a lot. One is that the majority of kinky people are, in fact, poly. I am not sure where this came from.
I would challenge the numbers.
And I'm not sure how anyone could even prove that, to be honest with you. It's not like there's a registry. Well, we don't have like a registry.
Okay. In fairness, there are registries. There are very many of them. You've belonged to one in the past. I happen to know. But that doesn't... You can't just take a roll call and assume that this gives you numbers and proof of anything.
Well, there's no centralized kinky people registry, and there's certainly no centralized poly people registry either.
No,
I can't cross-reference. It's not a thing.
I'll give you that.
Doesn't exist. There's not a list of kinky people and poly people that I can cross-reference and give you hard numbers. In my experience and my subjective perception of the situation, I said this point blank earlier to someone. I was like, it's been my experience that I would guess, and this is just me guessing, and it's very subjective, obviously, but I would guess that there are probably more poly kinky people than there are poly vanilla people. Just based on my own anecdotal experiences.
That might be fair to say. But that doesn't mean that there are more poly people total than there are monogamous people. That being poly doesn't make you part of a majority anywhere.
And I'm seeing numbers thrown around. Well, the overwhelming majority of kinky people are poly. 95% of kinky people are poly, which is oddly specific considering there is no hard data on this.
I'm back to I would challenge you to I challenge your math.
And I have asked, but of course they cannot provide any hard data because there isn't any. It just doesn't exist. It's not a thing.
Show your work.
I got my degree in education, y'all. So I'm going to need you to show your work, please.
You got your degree in education. I teach history, so
citation needed. I don't.
Yeah.
There's no evidence on this. Like I said, my subjective anecdotal guess would be that there are probably more kinky poly people than there are vanilla poly people. Although that could be wrong, but that's been my perception of the situation. But I don't think there are more kinky poly people than there are kinky monogamous people. That has certainly not jived with my experience, like at all. I still think that monogamy still probably outnumbers poly, even in the kink communities, just because people have been told for so long that monogamy was the sort of natural way of things. And so I think it probably still outweighs poly in sheer numbers, even in the kink community. I think that's probably, and like I said, again, we're talking guesses, but I feel like that's probably a fair guess. And which pulls the other point that I have, that there is another common sort of misconception that I would really ask my fellow poly people to please get it together on. Poly is not inherently better than monogamy for all people.
I'm again going to have to ask you to show your work, because no.
It's not objectively better. It seems better to poly people because they are poly. But the same is true of monogamy for monogamous people. Monogamy seems better to them because they are monogamous. And it's not so cut and dry as to say that poly is inherently better. It's not better in all relationships. It's not better for all people. It just isn't. And that ties into the idea that not everyone can or should be poly.
No, I would argue, and I was gonna spring this on you, so I'm glad you went there, because as we've been talking, it's an idea that's come to me. I would argue that much like sexual preference isn't a choice, I don't think necessarily that poly or monogamy are a choice. I could be wrong. I'll fully admit that, but I would imagine, and I do imagine, that there are poly people. There are people who are wired that way, who are wired to share their affection with a group of people and aren't happy any other way. And I imagine also that there are people who are monogamous who, once they find that one person, they're done. I have tried monogamous relationships. I'm wholly miserable would be the word that comes to mind there. Well, term, I guess, that comes to mind there.
I think there's something also to consider, and I don't know if you've seen this. I'm going to pull it up on my phone while we're talking about this, because this is something I find very, very interesting, in that much as we've come to recognize that, well, not everyone has, but many of us have come to recognize that gender exists on a spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not cut and dry. It's not a binary necessarily, and it exists in sort of a spectrum of gender identities. And many of us have come to sort of recognize that that's the case. The other thing that we have also, many people have begun to recognize is that sexuality exists on a spectrum. And there are many different sort of orientations that can exist, and they are not all, it's not so cut and dry. It's not just heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual. There is a broad sort of spectrum of sexuality. And what we are, I at least am starting to realize, and a number of people are, is that monogamy and polyamory are, again, not a binary sort of thing. No. Necessarily. I think they probably exist on a spectrum in a sense as well, that there is a broad sort of spectrum. And I saw this, it's a cake slice where you can identify with a number and a color. I don't know if you've seen this. Like a pie chart? Well, it's actually it's a block of colors. And what it talks about is the attraction layer cake, they call it. And it talks about attraction type. And it goes from aromantic asexuality, romantic asexuality, tertiary sexuality, secondary sexuality, primary sexuality, and aromantic sexuality. It's a spectrum. Everything from no sexual or romantic attraction to non-romantic sexual attraction only, and a variety of things in between. You realize that you've just effectively challenged one of the core tenets that you and I have held since we started this, and done it well. Okay. We've tried to tell our audience from the beginning that without some form of romantic connection between partners, BDSM doesn't work. And you've just effectively blown that out of the water. I kind of did. I would point out that I think an aromantic sexuality, while it probably can exist in BDSM, is probably also more difficult in BDSM. I would agree with you. And I would hold to that. I do challenge. Yeah. I am challenging without realizing it that yes, it can exist. However, it is probably, I still think, more difficult. So everyone, if you follow this, everyone is a color. Every charcoal, gray, orchid, pink, red, or crimson. You are a number. That's your orientation. So attracted exclusively to genders different than one's own, mostly to genders different than one's own, prefers partners genders different than one's own, but also attracted to people of the same gender. Attraction is not influenced by gender, prefers partners whose gender matches their own, mostly attracted to people whose gender matches their own, and exclusively attracted to people whose gender matches their own, which draws a very clear spectrum of sexuality, that it's not quite so simple as gay, straight, bi. Right. And the thing that caught my attention about this is that the layer cake model also addresses monogamy versus polyamory. And it refers to a spectrum: strictly monogamous, primarily monogamous, desiring of monogamy, monogamous relationships first and foremost, but willing to explore polyamory for the happiness of their partner or other reasons. No preference, meaning they're perfectly happy either way. Primarily polyamorous, but willing to explore monogamy for the happiness of their partner or other reasons, and strictly polyamorous. And I think that's something that's really very important in this concept, in that it does sort of matter, and it's not quite so simple as, sort of, and those are defined by letters in the layer cake. And so it matters in that sense because, I tell you, I send this to someone and say I'm, a red 2C, by which I mean I am red, meaning I am sexual attraction exists, and may or may not be acted upon. However, other components are essential to the relationship. I'm not capable of aromantic sexuality. I am a 2, meaning I prefer partners whose genders are different than my own, but I am also attracted to people of the same gender. And I am a C, meaning I have no preference. I can be polyamorous or monogamous depending on the situation. But the C part is what makes me sort of flexible on that. Many people are either an A or B or a D or E, meaning they are strictly or primarily monogamous or strictly or primarily polyamorous. And the reason I kind of get into this is because it matters, because there's this assumption that poly is somehow better and that everyone can be made poly if they're willing. And I don't believe that to be true.
Not everybody can be made poly, just as not everybody is made straight. I'm sorry. I hate to burst the bubble of our Christian conservative friends out there, but that doesn't happen.
You can't turn someone straight any more than you can turn them gay, and you can't turn someone poly or turn them monogamous unless they are a C, which, like I said, I am. But that is a unique thing. Most people don't fall into that C section where we're really very much a case by case. Yeah,
I would agree. And I'm glad you brought that to us. It's not a chart that I've seen, and I doubt very seriously it's a chart that I could see. But you laid it out fairly effectively.
I may type it out for you because it is a graphic that you're going to have difficulty seeing because of the colors. But I can type out a list.
I'd appreciate that.
Curious.
I really would.
Because I think it sums it up very, very well, and it allows you to sort of say, I am a, Crimson 3B. Okay, see, that tells me a lot about where you fall on the relationship spectrum. And I think it draws that very clearly, and it makes the point that just as gender and sexuality and sexual attraction are spectrums, so is poly and monogamy. It's not a binary situation where someone is either poly or monogamous, or worse still, it's not a fluid thing that you can turn someone into.
No. It's not. And please don't.
And so, I want to point that out to people. Don't try to turn your partners poly if they're not. If they aren't, they aren't. And don't. And there's a common. Polyamory was looked down on for a long time. And
it still is in most.
Yes. Even in the kink circles, it was sort of looked down on because it was seen as, sort of cheating or greedy or, any number of other negative adjectives that you can throw at it. And that has lessened, at least within the kink community. Poly is far more accepted today than it used to be. But that is turning into something very ugly. Just because poly is okay and valid, and it is, let's be very clear, so is monogamy. Our monogamous folks out there are not boring or insecure or jealous or close-minded necessarily, just by virtue of being monogamous. I mean, some monogamous people might be close-minded, but it's not because they're monogamous. And I've seen all these things being said by poly people. And it's just not true. Monogamy and polyamory are both perfectly valid relationship types. And one final point that I want to bring up, because I see this come up so often, and it is, I always want to just shake someone when they say it, because it bugs me so very much. Just as You've heard it said, I'm sure, that having a baby won't fix a failing relationship.
Yeah.
Because it will not.
It doesn't, no. Usually makes it worse.
It usually does. Poly won't either. If you and your partner are having relationship issues,
adding another person to the mix is more likely than anything only going to hasten your trip to divorce courts.
There are a couple of valid reasons to explore a poly setup. One is that you are inherently a poly person, and that is going to make you much happier. My husband sort of leans that way, naturally, which is sort of his nature. The other valid reason is, and this is dicey territory, if you have an otherwise stable relationship, it is a loving, stable, healthy relationship in every way, except for one area, usually something sexual. Maybe one of you is bi. Maybe one of you is a switch and not, maybe one of you is kinky and the other one isn't. If the relationship is otherwise healthy, then exploring getting those specific needs met elsewhere can sometimes be a healthy option. But you have to be careful.
You have to be careful, and you have to communicate. If you choose to explore the option of getting those needs met elsewhere, don't do it behind your partner's back.
Do not. It will never end well. It won't end well. And this slightly controversial statement goes out to any of my listeners, our listeners, who may in fact find themselves currently in situations where you have a partner of some description who has another partner that doesn't know about you. I want to tell you, as someone who's been where you are, not by choice, but I was, if they will cheat with you, they will cheat on you. And both poly and kink require trust.
If they will lie for you, they will lie to you.
So I'm going to sort of wrap us up. And just as a brief recap, poly is awesome, or at least it can be if it's done right.
For the right people.
It requires communication, honesty, trust, and real effort.
No lie.
Cheating is not poly. Poly is not just about sex. Poly is not inherently better than monogamy. And no, not everyone can be made poly. And no, poly will not fix your failing marriage or failing relationship.
Anyone who tells you it will is lying to you. Please advance as quickly as possible in the opposite direction.
Knowing all of that, if poly sounds fantastic to you, if it resonates with you, then I encourage you to explore it with the full knowledge and consent of your partner and have all manner of awesome kinky fun while you do it. Just do it right. I'm thinking, before we end this week's episode, about what we want to talk about next week. And
yeah,
I had the thought that we talked a lot about styles of dominance on a previous episode. And I thought it might be interesting as a currently engaged submissive and a currently engaged dominant to touch on the different styles of submission. There are many. And
yes.
I think sometimes these terms are a little unfamiliar, especially to some of our newer folks. And it might be really helpful to kind of go through bottom versus sub versus slave versus kitten and little and brat and all the different service subs and all the various ways, permutations that can take.
We can certainly try.
And maybe we can kind of run through a little bit of that and kind of help our listeners along that journey learn sort of the different ways, some of the different ways. I won't presume to think we can cover every single permutation because there are so many, but some of the different ways that submission can kind of look in practice. And so that's, I think, what I will. So I think that's what we'll tune in next week, if you will, our listeners, and we'll talk about that. We talked about styles of dominance. Let's talk a little bit about styles of submission. Kind of get into that a little bit. And until then, stay safe out there, stay kinky, and have all the kinky fun that you want to do.
Waiting for you to kill it, hon.